Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and obviously still on the road, actually stranded due to ice here in Austin, Texas. So I am still on the road, even though I was supposed to be home today. That said, let's dive right in and talk about big tech because the question I'm asking today is, will big tech prioritize humanity over profits? Are they ever going to do that? This is actually really interesting, and it's coming from a Wall Street Journal article by author Gillian K. Melchior. I apologize already for mispronouncing that name if I did. And basically, this regards US and Western companies compromising their morals by working with China. And I'm going to quote essentially a lot of this here because I think it opens up a lot of questions inside and outside of China as well. And I have a lot of thoughts on this, but here's the backdrop of what's going on. A new report by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and the consulting firm Horizon Advisory finds that doing business in China has implicated U.S. and multinational corporations in the Communist Party's human rights abuses, the surveillance of the Chinese population, and Beijing's military buildup. Obviously, if we are looking at biased sources, a group called Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation obviously has a bit of a bias against communism. That said, a lot of this is corroborated by reporting in the past. And as I've continuously reported on China and done research on China and talked about these kinds of things, a lot of what they are saying has been reported by other sources as well. So we're not just taking them at their word, because quite frankly, there is a long history here, and I will dive into that as well. Now, this report seeks to essentially grade several companies on their business in China in a uniform way. And I quote, "This research does not assume that doing business in China is inherently wrong, but support for Beijing's military modernization, surveillance state, and human rights abuses is corporate leaders must recognize as much." Now, the US government says that the Communist Party in China is actually committing genocide against the Uyghurs, particularly in the Xinjiang province. And this is an advisory that came out last summer from State, Treasury, and several other departments that warn that, quote, "Given the severity and extent of these abuses, businesses and individuals that do not exit supply chains, ventures, and or investments connected to Xinjiang could run a high risk of violating U.S. law." Now, the report finds, in this case, as an example, that Dell, as of Dell Computers, has an office in Urumqi, which is Xinjiang's capital. Now, a Dell spokeswoman, Carly Tatum, said in an email statement to the Wall Street Journal that, and I quote, "The office is in the process of being closed due to low utilization, and we are constantly reviewing and adjusting our global footprint." General Electric, or GE, has a joint venture with HDGE, which is basically with China Huadian. This is a state-owned enterprise. Last year, China Huadian signed a strategic cooperation agreement with the Xinjiang government, according to Chinese news sources. Now, GE declined to comment about China Huadian's business dealings. It noted that China Huadian is not on the Commerce Department's export or entity list, which restricts access to U.S. exports. They're not on the Treasury Department's sanction list or the Defense Department list of Chinese military companies. GE says the work that it does with China Huadian doesn't involve controlled technologies, meaning those technologies that are not allowed to be exported to a country like China. Now, the Wall Street Journal, reported in 2019 that the Chinese surveillance systems were using Intel chips. Intel obviously is a US-based company that makes obviously very advanced processors. The report's authors examined Chinese procurement records and found that public security bureaus in Xinjiang bought Intel hard disks in 2020 and Intel servers in 2021, although, quote, "Intel might not know about or be able to control these uses, as some Intel products are obviously sold through vendors, middlemen, all of that. I usually, if I'm buying Intel products, I'm not contacting Intel directly, I'm contacting large distributors." Now, that said, Intel says that if it becomes aware of a business partner that might be using its products in connection with human rights abuses, and I quote, "We will restrict or cease business with the third party until and unless we have high confidence that Intel's products are not being used to violate human rights. So there you go. There's Intel's stance. They may not know, but they are being used in surveillance technology in the controlled area or province of Xinjiang, where a lot of these human rights abuses against the Uyghurs are happening. Microsoft is also listed in this report because they also appear to have troublesome ties to Chinese police and surveillance state. HiYi Software, a company that provides surveillance-related products, such as a, quote, social face and vehicle verification platform to public security bureaus across all of China, lists Microsoft as a partner on their website. So does Beijing Zhangke Fuxing Information Technology, which lists among its, quote, success cases work with several detention centers, including Xinjiang. By deadline, Microsoft did not provide a comment or a response, essentially, to the inquiries by the Wall Street Journal on this. And that obviously is a very deeply troubling issue, especially if Microsoft technology is being leveraged for surveillance in essentially these areas across China. The report also raises alarms about how American and multinational companies and their partnerships may help the Chinese government gain access to sensitive technologies, including those with military applications. Under, for the record, the National Strategic Plan in China called Made in China 2025, Beijing seeks to acquire foreign technology. Dell's China-based subsidiary co-authored a 2018 report on digital industrialization with the State Council, which is China's top administrative authority. It explicitly mentioned the development of, and I quote, emerging technologies such as cloud computing, big data, and artificial intelligence, all areas that obviously have military applications, in addition to civilian ones as well. And obviously that is a deep, deep concern as well. Now, these are only a few of the obvious troublesome findings in this report. As I've mentioned, this has been corroborated by multiple news outlets over the years, but they are putting this together in a concise way, going through these records, looking for the Dells, the Intels, the Microsofts of the world. And the authors conclude that American corporations, quote, have in many cases traded support for Beijing's military modernization, surveillance state, and human rights violation in exchange for access to China's market. But in an environment where the private sector is the leading global source of innovation, capital, and influence, the stakes of this Faustian bargain are enormous. Now, I have a lot of thoughts on this. The first one being that we have a massive problem with intellectual property theft coming out of China. And so we have seen essentially the Chinese attempt to clone things like Intel processors, NVIDIA processors for graphics, all those kinds of things as well. And so it is really interesting to see, for example, a US-based corporation start manufacturing these kinds of sensitive technologies, especially those with export control, in China or around China, not to mention having things like Intel processors arrive in China, or let's say advanced firewalls with encryption systems, all those kinds of things. So that intellectual property theft, I think, is something that we really have to address, and that obviously is a huge problem. Also, it's been long known that big tech has basically kowtowed to the Chinese government in order to gain access to what is becoming the largest and most definitely the most populous market for their technology. So both Google and Apple have publicly made concessions in terms of censorship in order to sell iPhones and obviously get their search engines in front of billions. Both of those are censored, as I mentioned, and if you are interested in what Google was attempting a few years ago, you can go Google Project Dragonfly, and there you go. You will see exactly the kind of censorship that Google was willing to do for the Chinese population based on the Chinese government's demands, so Google could stay in the country as a major presence. Also, it goes beyond big tech. I mean, look at movie studios, and they're viewing this as a huge market as well, to the point where All-American wrestler and super famous actor John Cena had to apologize in near perfect Chinese, basically to the Chinese people in a video that he posted for saying that Taiwan is its own country. This is something that China has disputed. They have what they call the one-state solution, that Taiwan is a wayward state but part of China, whereas Taiwan kind of disagrees, but not publicly so, to maintain this balance. And the United States has not come out and said that Taiwan is or is not part of China, but we back Taiwan, whatever they consider themselves to be, and here we are. But nevertheless, John Cena, who I believe was in a movie called The Marine, basically all-American boy, had to come out in, like I said, perfect Chinese and do that. You can go Google that one too. It's really interesting. Also, the general public here in the United States, and I assume probably in other Western areas like Australia, Europe, etc., really don't seem to care, because the tech that we continuously buy is much cheaper due to the lack of labor laws and forced labor that China employs. So if we can get our mobile phones and Amazon Echoes on the cheap, then who really cares, right? And I think that's something that we really have to understand. That, okay, maybe it's $1,000 for an iPhone, which in and of itself is expensive, and it might be $1,200 if it was manufactured in the United States or a country that doesn't have, let's say, the rights abuses that China seems to have right now. And so is it worth an extra $200? Usually the public says no. And I think that's a bit of an issue. That's a hearts and minds problem that we've got. I don't think that American and Western companies really want to improve China's surveillance systems or help them expand their vast military expansion or oppression of an entire culture that governments outside of the United States and the United States has said essentially is tantamount to genocide. I simply think that they're making a cost calculation, essentially that it's in their ultimate best interest to deal with China. Now, for the record, I'm a capitalist at heart. I have started and I've grown multiple businesses, but I also have to sleep at night. And if I knew that my products, whatever they may be, were being created by possible slave labor, or I was helping to further the goals of an authoritarian regime, I would be actively looking to exit those agreements and retool and find better solutions, even if it meant sacrificing some profits, understanding that, hey, I'm not going to make $1 billion this year. Maybe I'm going to make 800 million. I'm still doing pretty damn good. And I'm fine with that. And I think that's something that we really need to address. We really need to understand here. So when we are focused on purely making money, we can lose sight of our humanity. And that is honestly something we should never lose sight of. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please stay private. Thanks, everyone.